History is a lie told by the survivors. We are taught that the end of a queen is a dignified affair, a flash of steel, a silent prayer, and then peace. But the biology of death does not care about dignity. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn did not die when the sword passed through her neck. As her head hit the sawdust, her brain was still firing. For 30 agonizing seconds, she was a conscious mind trapped inside a severed skull. She could see the boots of her executioner. She could hear the gasp of the crowd. She could feel the sudden, impossible absence of her own body. This was not a mercy. It was a calculated psychological horror, engineered by a king who didn't just want her gone. Illinois, he wanted her unmade. To understand the fall of Anne Boleyn, you have to stop looking at the sword. The sword was merely the final click of a lock that had been turning for weeks. The true execution didn't happen on the scaffold. It happened in the silence of the Tower of London. In May 1536, the Tudor state was a machine, and Thomas Cromwell was its lead engineer. He did not need a torture rack to break a queen. He understood that the human mind is its own worst enemy when placed in total isolation. When Anne was first brought to the Tower, she wasn't thrown into a damp, dark dungeon. That would have been too simple. Instead, she was placed in the royal apartments, the very same rooms where she had slept 3 years earlier, the night before her coronation. This was the first act of psychological warfare. Imagine standing in a room filled with gold-threaded tapestries and a crackling fire, knowing that the door behind you is bolted. The luxury is a mockery. Every time Anne looked at the velvet canopy of her bed, she was reminded of the height from which she had fallen. The contrast between the comfort she could see and the captivity she could feel started to crack her. She would collapse into fits of weeping, followed immediately by bouts of hysterical, screaming laughter. Cromwell didn't just lock her in. He surrounded her with ghosts. He assigned 4 women to serve her. They weren't friends. They weren't even neutral. One was her aunt, Lady Shelton, who had spent years publicly resenting Anne's rise to power. These women were instructed to be silent. They were furniture with eyes. They watched her eat. They watched her pace the floor at 3 a.m. They watched her stare at the ceiling, waiting for a sign of hope that would never come. Anne was a woman who had survived the most dangerous court in Europe for a decade. She was used to talking her way out of trouble. But you cannot negotiate with a wall. You cannot charm a person who is ordered not to speak back. In that silence, Anne's brain began to leak. She started talking to herself. She started bringing up names: Henry Norris, Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton. She wasn't confessing to adultery. She was simply reaching for any human connection, any memory of the world outside. But every word she whispered into the empty air of that room was being written down. Every sigh was recorded. Every panicked thought was ferried across the river to Cromwell's desk. And Boleyn was unknowingly building her own scaffold, one sentence at a time. The trap wasn't made of iron. It was made of velvet, silence, and the slow, deliberate destruction of a woman's sanity. The machine was humming, and the blade hadn't even left France yet. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. While Anne paced her velvet cage, the Tudor machine moved into the streets of London. To kill a queen, you must first kill her reputation. You must strip her of every man who ever stood in her shadow. Thomas Cromwell did not start with the highborn lords. He started with the weakest link in the chain. Mark Smeaton was a musician, a commoner, a man who lived by the grace of the court's elite. He had no noble blood to protect him, no family crest to ward off the king's men. When Cromwell's agents took him, they didn't go to the official interrogation chambers of the Tower. They took him to a private house in Stepney. This was an off-the-books operation. No witnesses, No records. No mercy. They used a knotted rope. They wrapped it around Smeaton's skull and inserted a wooden toggle. With every turn of the wood, the rope bit deeper into his temples. His eyes bulged. The pressure inside his head became a screaming, white-hot agony. Smeaton was a lute player, a man of art and melody, suddenly thrust into a world of raw, physical physics. He lasted as long as a human body could. Then, he gave them what they wanted. He signed a confession. He admitted to a sexual relationship with the Queen that never happened. Smeaton was the first domino. But he wasn't enough. Cromwell needed more than the word of a commoner to topple a queen. He turned his sights on Henry Norris, the king's most intimate friend. Norris was the groom of the stool, the man who dressed the king, who heard his secrets, who stood closer to Henry VIII than anyone else in England. On the ride back from the May Day joust, the king himself confronted Norris. Henry offered him a choice: confess to the affair and receive a full royal pardon, or maintain your innocence and die. Norris looked at his king, the man he had served for years, and refused. He told Henry he would rather die 1,000 deaths than falsely accuse an innocent woman. It was a moment of rare, blinding integrity in a court built on shadows. But in the Tudor machine, integrity is just another obstacle to be removed. Norris was arrested on the spot. Within days, the net tightened. Francis Weston, a young and handsome courtier, was seized. William Brereton followed. And then, the ultimate blow, George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, was arrested. The charge against George was incest. There was no evidence. There were no witnesses. But that didn't matter. The charge of incest was a biological weapon. If the public believed that and had committed the most unnatural sin possible with her own blood, they wouldn't just want her dead, they would want her erased. They would view her not as a woman, but as a monster. Inside the tower, the 4 silent women in Anne's room finally began to speak. They didn't offer comfort. They dripped information into her ears like poison. They told her Smeaton had confessed. They told her Norris was in chains. They told her George was in a cell just a few hundred yards away. Every name they mentioned was a limb being hacked off Anne's political body. She could feel her influence evaporating. She could feel the world forgetting her while she was still breathing. The walls of her room, once symbols of royalty, now felt like the interior of a coffin. She was being buried alive, one headline at a time. Cromwell's architecture was perfect. He didn't just want a corpse, he wanted a void. By the time the trial began, there was nothing left of Anne Boleyn but a ghost in a grey dress. On May 15, 1536, the Great Hall of the Tower of London was transformed into a stage. 2,000 people squeezed into the space, their breath turning the air thick and humid. At the front of the room sat 26 peers of the realm, the highest-ranking men in England. These were the men Anne had danced with, the men who had bowed to her, the men who had begged for her favor. Now, they sat in a semicircle of cold silk and fur, acting as her judges. At the center of this semicircle sat the Duke of Norfolk. He was Anne's own uncle. But in the architecture of the Tudor state, blood is thinner than survival. Norfolk did not look at his niece with pity. He looked at her as a political liability that needed to be liquidated, and entered the hall. She was dressed in black damask, her posture so straight it looked painful. She did not look like a woman who had spent weeks in psychological isolation. She looked like a queen attending a private audience. This was her final defense, her dignity. She knew that if she crumbled, the lie won. If she stood tall, the truth might at least haunt them. The accusations were read aloud. They were a fevered dream of political desperation. Adultery with 5 different men. Plotting to poison the king's first wife. Conspiring to murder Henry himself. mocking the king's lack of virility. Every charge was designed to hit Henry where he was most fragile, his ego and his legacy. Then came the defense. And Boleyn was a woman of the Renaissance. She was sharp, educated, and possessed a mind that could cut through a legal argument like a razor. She dismantled the prosecution's timeline. She pointed out that on the dates she was accused of being in London committing adultery, she was actually miles away, recovering from childbirth or under the constant watch of dozens of attendants. She asked how a common musician like Mark Smeaton could have entered the private, guarded chambers of a queen without a single soul noticing. For a few hours, the room shifted. The murmurs in the gallery changed tone. People began to realize that the evidence was not just thin, it was non-existent. There were witnesses who later wrote that they would have bet their lives on her acquittal. She had won the argument, but she had already lost the verdict. In a Tudor treason trial, the jury doesn't look at the facts, they look at the king's signature. To find an innocent was to find Henry VIII a liar. And no man in that room was brave enough to choose the truth over his own head. One by one, the peers stood up. They placed their hands over their hearts and spoke the word that ended the world: guilty. The Duke of Norfolk rose to deliver the sentence. His voice, usually booming, reportedly cracked. He told his niece that she was to be taken to the Tower Green, where she would be burned at the stake or beheaded, at the king's pleasure. And did not scream. She did not beg for mercy. She looked at the men who had just traded her life for their own safety and told them that she was prepared to die. She expressed only one regret, that the men accused with her friends, her brother, were to be executed for a crime that never happened. She was led back to her cell. The trial was over. The theater was finished. Now, the mechanics of the ending began to take shape, and Henry VIII, in a final, twisted gesture of mercy, decided to change the weapon. Even 500 years later, the records of May 1536 feel like a redacted crime scene. When we look closely at the linguistic DNA of the Tudor regime's paperwork, we find more than just lies. We find voids. There are questions that the architecture of the tower could never fully contain, questions that still haunt the stones of the green. Thomas Cromwell was a man of meticulous detail. He kept receipts for everything, from the cost of the king's velvet slippers to the exact number of logs burned in the tower's fireplaces. Yet, the primary evidence used to convict Anne Boleyn, the secret letters and the detailed transcripts of her alleged affairs, has vanished. Did they ever exist? Or were they burned the moment the blade fell to ensure no future generation could prove the Queen's innocence? The legal records of the trial are strangely hollow, as if the state was afraid of its own shadow. The charge against George Boleyn was the most explosive. It was designed to turn the stomach of every Englishman. But why would a man like George, who was noted for his intelligence and his deep bond with his sister, refuse to confess even under the threat of a much more painful death? At his trial, George was handed a piece of paper containing a specific accusation. He was told to read it silently. Instead, he read it aloud to the entire court, mocking the absurdity of the state's desperation. If the crime was real, why was the state so terrified of the public hearing the details? For centuries, rumors persisted that Anne had a sixth finger or a large mole on her neck, the devil's marks. Yet, the ladies who dressed her every day, including those planted by Cromwell to spy on her, never reported such a thing in their secret dispatches. Why did the regime allow these supernatural rumors to flourish while officially charging her with legal treason? Was the plan to execute her as a woman, or to erase her as a human being? This is the question that science asks of history. When the swordsman from France performed his miracle of precision, he severed the head with such speed that the brain's oxygen supply wasn't immediately depleted. Witnesses reported that her lips moved in prayer after the head was held aloft. What was she thinking in those final 30 seconds of consciousness? Did she see the crowd that had cheered for her coronation now cheering for her blood? Did she feel the cold air hitting the back of her throat where her body used to be? Or, in those final flickers of neural activity, did she realize that by dying with dignity, she had just secured the throne for her daughter? The official version says she died instantly. The biological reality suggests she spent half a minute in a sensory nightmare that no human mind was ever designed to endure. We will never know what those eyes saw in their final, erratic sweeps of the Tower Green. The truth died with the neurons. As Anne Boleyn knelt in the sawdust of the low scaffold, the crowd noticed something missing. There was no wooden block. There was no curved notch for her to rest her chin. Because this was not an English execution, Henry VIII had reached across the channel to the town of Saint-Omer in France. He had hired a specialist, a man who did not use the heavy, clumsy axe that often required 3 or 4 hacking strikes to finish the job. This man brought a massive, double-edged continental sword. It was a weapon forged for a single, horizontal sweep. But for the sword to work, the anatomy of the victim had to be perfect. And knelt upright. Her spine was a vertical line. Her neck was bared to the grey London sky. One of her ladies stepped forward and tied a linen blindfold around her eyes. The world went black for the Queen. She could no longer see the 2,000 faces pressing against the wood. She could only hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of her own heart and the distant crying of a woman in the front row. The swordsman emerged from the corner. He wore no mask. He wore no heavy leather apron. He was dressed in close-fitting black, moving with the quiet economy of a professional. He stepped onto the platform and signaled to his assistant. He knew the danger of the human reflex. If Anne felt the blade coming, her shoulders would hunch. Her trapezius muscles would tighten. The collarbone would rise. If the steel hit a tensed muscle or a shifted bone, it would deflect. It would turn a clean execution into a jagged, screaming slaughter. He needed to trick her brain into relaxing for 1 microsecond. "Bring me my sword," the Frenchman shouted toward the steps, his voice cracking through the silence like a whip. It was a brilliant, cruel distraction, and heard the command. Her brain interpreted it as a delay. She thought the weapon was still being fetched. She thought she had a few more seconds of air. Her head turned slightly toward the sound of the shout. In that instant, the geometry of her neck shifted. The skin stretched taut. The gap between the 3rd and 4th vertebrae opened by a fraction of a millimeter. The sword was already in his hand, hidden in the straw at his feet. He swung. The blade did not chop, it swept. It moved in a flat, horizontal arc powered by the rotation of his entire torso. The steel met the side of her neck and passed through the skin, the carotid arteries, and the jugular veins in a single microsecond. Blood pressure to the brain dropped to 0 before the nerves could even register the sensation of cold metal. The edge slid between the vertebrae, shearing through the spinal cord like a hot wire through wax. The head separated. It struck the pine boards with a wet, heavy thud. For a heartbeat, the body remained upright, balanced on its knees by residual muscle tension, before collapsing backward. Blood erupted from the open neck in rhythmic pulses, soaking into the gravel beneath the scaffold. The swordsman stepped forward. He reached down and grabbed the linen coif, lifting the severed head high for the crowd to see. This is where their official history ends. But the biological horror was just beginning. Modern neuroscience tells us that the brain does not die the moment the heart stops. The neurons inside the skull hold a residual charge of oxygen. For 30 seconds, and Boleyn was still there. The witnesses on the green didn't cheer. They recoiled, because the face they were looking at was still moving. Anne's eyes were wide, The pupils dilated into massive black circles. They weren't fixed, they were darting. They tracked the movement of the crowd. They looked at the executioner's hand. Her mouth worked up and down, the lips pressing together in a silent, desperate rhythm. She was trying to finish the prayer the sword had cut in half. Inside that severed head, she was conscious. She could feel the cold air hitting the raw tissue. She could see the world from a height of 6 feet, held aloft by her own hair. She was a mind without a body, a queen reduced to a sensory nightmare. And then, the flicker died. The oxygen ran out. The darkness she had been waiting for finally took her. The Tudor state had won. They had dismantled her mind in the tower. They had dismantled her reputation in the hall. And finally, they had dismantled her body on the green. They buried her in an old elm chest meant for arrows, beneath the floorboards of the Tower Chapel. No monument, no name, just a void in the earth. But as the fog cleared over the Thames that afternoon, the machine realized its mistake. You can kill a woman. You can even erase her name. But you cannot kill the 30 seconds of truth that haunt the conscience of a nation. And Boleyn was gone. But the linguistic DNA of her execution would remain etched into the stones of England forever. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.